proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Can I call Mr. Paul Blomfield to move the motion?
Sir George, I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of minimum income requirements for partner and spousal visas, and I'm pleased to do so with you in the chair. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the Backbench Business Committee for providing me with this opportunity, as well as members from across the House who supported the application. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to raise the issue because I think there has been insufficient attention given to the threshold changes within the wider debate on migration. Insufficient attention, that is, except for those whose lives have been turned upside down by December's announcement. Now, many of those people have written to me, constituents affected, and I know they've written to many colleagues too. They are victims of the chaos in government migration policy, which doesn't seem to extend beyond the mantra of stopping the boats. Now, the government has, well, I see the Minister shaking his head, and I'll be making some points to him. The government has talked up migration as a problem, but it's failed to come up with a solution which addresses the real challenges. So, when faced with the rising net migration figures in November, the government seemed to hit out in all directions, looking to headlines, but without regard to the consequences. So removing the rights for care workers to bring dependents, without regard to the impact on those needing care, increasing the salary threshold for the skilled worker visa without regard to the needs of critical sectors, reviewing the graduate visa without regard to the impact on universities, whose funding model has been designed by this government to be dependent on international students, and in relation to this debate, introducing new thresholds for family visas without regard to the consequences for families. Now, let me be absolutely clear to the Minister. Nobody wants uncontrolled migration. What people want is a comprehensive plan which is fair to people and works in the interest of our country. And the announcement for family visas fails that benchmark. It had all the feel of a policy developed on the back of a fag packet, as we used to say. First, the government announced that they were more than doubling the threshold to 38,700 by spring 24. Then within days, they changed course, saying it would be a phased approach starting at 29,000 in spring 24, rising to 34,500 at some unspecified date later in 24, and then 38,700. Only later, in response to a petition, did they confirm that the 38,700 would be delayed until early 2025. Originally, a spokesperson said the threshold would apply to visa extensions, only thankfully to later contradict that and confirm it wouldn't be the case. But what's left from the original announcement remains a big change, and so, as required, the Home Office carried out an impact assessment. Problem is, they've refused to publish it, which was highlighted by the House of Lords scrutiny report recently, presumably, as with previous Home Office impact assessments, because they knew that the results were not favourable to their arguments. So let me share the impact that my constituents have told me that it would have on their marriages, on their family life, on their future. The first constituent to write to me was a charity worker, and as such, willing to accept a low income. But his willingness to make that salary sacrifice would stop him having the opportunity to settle here with his fiancée from Argentina. Another told me that he'd met his Chinese girlfriend while studying at university, and they'd planned to start their graduate life together in the UK, but now won't be able to do so. A midwife told me that she can't bring her husband over for them to start their family here. One man wrote to me to say he'd recently got engaged to his partner in Qatar and planned to have a civil partnership here back home in the UK, but those plans were off. Others told me that they were considering dropping out of degrees to fund full-time employment to meet income requirements, And one told me of the devastating choice between leaving the UK or leaving the person they love.
I thank the honourable friend for giving way and holding this important debate. The most common origin countries where family-related visas were granted last year were Pakistan and India. But workers of Pakistani heritage have the lowest median hourly pay of any ethnic group, meaning they are less likely to meet the minimum income threshold. So does he share my concern that this policy only entrenches the UK's hostile immigration environment, as it is likely to be overwhelmingly discriminatory against ethnic minorities, particularly British Asians?
My honourable friend makes an important point, and it's one that I'm going to come on to. But across communities, ordinary people doing valuable jobs are having to rethink their lives. Now let's just reflect for a moment about the sort of jobs that wouldn't reach this minimum income.
Thank Ron for giving way. I congratulate him on a really important speech that he's making here. I too have had a number of constituents in touch. People are really upset, they're bewildered, they can't quite believe that it's happening. One constituent wrote of how this legislation will impact on a close friend and described the changes as having discriminatory and classist overtones, and they went on to say no other respectable free country financially penalises its citizens for marrying immigrants. And I think it's very moving, isn't it, when you think of it in those terms, because as you say, this is just people trying to go about their lives, they meet somebody, fall in love, and then they have to make this dreadful decision.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It's not simply discriminatory in the way that our colleague mentioned a moment ago, but also in terms of wealth. And so let's reflect on the sort of jobs that wouldn't reach this minimum income. A newly qualified nurse below the starting threshold on a salary of £28,407. A newly qualified teacher well below the higher threshold at £30,000. A starting police officer on £36,775, again below the threshold. Entry-level positions in business startups below the threshold at £37,500. The University of Sheffield told me of 557 of their researchers, people doing vital work in the life sciences, vital work in research for our economy, are on a salary below the threshold. According to the Migration Observatory, around 50% of UK employers earn less than the 29,000 threshold, 70% earn less than 38,700. So that means, Sir George, 50 to 70% unable to marry a non-British citizen of their choice and live together in the UK. And there are significant regional variations too, with average earnings in London around 30% higher than in the North East, for example. So people in South Yorkshire, in my area, average earnings are around 27,000. So people in Yorkshire and the Humber, North East, the North West, the East Midlands, Wales and Northern Ireland will be worst affected. The new rules will discriminate in other ways too. They will particularly affect women who on average earn less and are more likely to have caring responsibilities and therefore not working full time. They discriminate against ethnic minorities, as my honourable friend, the member for Manchester Gorton, has pointed out. And they have a disproportionate impact on the self-employed, on younger people, and at those in an early stage of their career. So why are the government doing it? Well, they argue that it's to stop people being a burden on the state, and I'll look forward to the Minister trying to advance that argument. But those... I will.
I'm grateful for giving me, because it's making a compelling case, and it's this question of regional and local variations. In my community, we expect young people to go away for further and higher education. There's limited provision within the community. And personally, I'm always somebody who encourages that, because I always say to young people, Orkney and Shetland will still be here when you're ready to come back. They go away, they meet people from other parts of the world, they fall in love, they want to bring them back. These are things that enrich our communities in so many different ways, quite apart from the economic and social contribution that they make. Does that aspect, or the human aspect, for communities like ours, not really bear to be given better consideration by the government?
Here.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. He's absolutely right. It is the failure to consider the human aspect of this decision which runs right through the policy. But as I say, the government are arguing it's to stop people being a burden on the state. But those who come to the UK on a spousal visa don't have access to public funds. And they're also required to contribute to the NHS costs via the immigration health surcharge, which has been significantly rising. Many of them are younger and don't use the NHS very much at that point. I will.
Thank you for giving way. And on that point, he says about the argument of immigrants being a burden on the state. There's been study after study that shows absolutely the reverse, because you get young, fit and healthy people coming to work here. They're not a burden on the state. They contribute to society. And so we really need to debunk that myth that the Tories are peddling.
Well, I have to say I wasn't suggesting that they were a burden. I was simply reflecting the government's argument, and she demonstrates, in addition to my argument, the way in which people clearly are not a burden. And it's not as if family migration is a big problem. Despite the absolute number of family visas issued nearly doubling from 2020 to the end of September 23, which I'm sure is a point the Minister is going to make, the proportion of family visas in relation to entry visas has consistently remained low, at 5%. So the policy isn't going to have a significant impact on the UK's net migration, but for the families affected, the effect is enormous. Separated, forced to live apart because they can't meet the threshold. Others, and it relates to my honourable friend's point, who could be making a valuable contribution in all sorts of careers in this country, will be forced to leave the UK altogether, and many have told me that that's their plan. And there is, and it reflects the earlier point, a fundamental unfairness that partners and families are being priced out of the right to live in the UK with a foreign partner, priced out of their right to a family life on the basis of how much they earn. A two-tier system based on wealth. And it's an approach, Sir George, that compares badly with other countries. Now let's remember, the challenges of migration policy face all developed countries. Sometimes the government suggests we've got this as a unique challenge, but every country in Europe, in the States, all the developed world faces those challenges. But they don't all adopt the same approach. Now, over the last few weeks, Australia has been quoted admiringly by the government as a model for migration policy. But it has no earnings threshold for family visas. In many other countries, like Germany, the right to reunite with spouses is almost automatic, with no income requirement. Now, some countries do require proof of sufficient resources, but for those that express that as a minimum income, including Belgium and Norway, the threshold is nowhere near that proposed by the government. Countries like Spain and the Netherlands link it to social security levels. In the US, it's 125% of federal poverty guidelines, which means in real terms it's pretty similar to the current threshold before the government proposed the changes in the UK. So it's no wonder that the Migrant Integration Policy Index, which compares countries across Europe, the US, Canada, Australia and others, ranks the UK as next to the bottom of 56 countries in terms of its policies on family reunification and integration. So there is a strong case for the government to think again. If we are to have a threshold at all, then there are fairer approaches. Currently, the threshold's close to the national minimum wage. That's one benchmark. It could be sent against the national living wage. For somebody working 37.5 hours a week, be just over 22,000, well below the proposed threshold. That would take out the wealth barrier to family life that the government's imposing. We could take account of spouses' anticipated earnings on arrival, as we do after they are in the UK. The point is, Sir George, that there are options. We need a root and branch review of the spousal migration rules, considering the unfairness at the heart and the disproportionate impact on so many of the government's proposals. In the meantime, the planned increases this year and in 2025 should be suspended, and the government should listen to those whose lives are being affected.
Can I remind members that those who want to be called should bob. The question is that this House has considered minimum income thresholds for partner and spousal visits. Stuart C. MacDonald.
It's a pleasure to be called so early in this debate. A debate on what is effectively a Tory means test on marriage. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Sheffield Central for securing it. It's almost never that I disagree with anything that he says in a debate, and today is no exception. So I thank him for his work in making sure we have this opportunity today. And it's around 7 years exactly since I led a debate on the same subject in this very room. But now the thresholds are even more arbitrarily brutal, and the number of people whose lives are going to be destroyed are even greater. With more people than ever before falling in love with someone from another country, the government is making it more difficult than ever before for that couple to enjoy their family life here. Brexit too, let's not forget, means that more people are impacted because our EU friends can no longer benefit from free movement but must seek to satisfy what are already the most draconian family visa rules in the world before the government implements these changes. The government is basically saying to many of our children and to future generations, you can fall in love with whoever you wish, but if you want to marry a non-UK national and you aren't earning whatever arbitrary sum I decide, you'll need to go and live somewhere else. You can have the love of your life, you can have your country and the right to live here, but you can't have both. And that is just not normal, Sir George. There are no other countries that are so cruelly anti-family. And it particularly sticks in the craw, given that so many members of the government have enjoyed international marriages here in the UK. One rule for the government, one rule for everybody else. So much for the Conservative Party claiming to be the party of the family. This is not a small C Conservative policy or a pro-family policy at all. It's a desperate and a reactionary policy, playing politics with the family lives of our children and with future generations. Now, at least when we had this debate 7 years ago, the government could point to the advice of the Migration Advisory Committee to justify the particular figure it had alighted upon as being the appropriate threshold. Now it seemed to pick some random numbers, ultimately matching it up with a Tier 2 working visa threshold that some people need to satisfy. The utterly critical question for the Minister today is why has the government decided that that particular number is appropriate? To my mind, he might as well match it up with the Prime Minister's salary. But if the Minister can't explain the logic behind this, not only is the policy utterly immoral, it may also be irrational and illegal as well. But neither has the government bothered to assess the impact that it's had on couples or their children, or perhaps more accurately, it has assessed the impact, it's just not going to publish. But back in 2015, England's Children's Commissioner did the government's job for it with her report on Skype families. That report showed tens of thousands of children having been negatively impacted by these rules. And I quote, "They are living separated from a parent with reported stress, anxiety and difficulties for the children and their families. Children and families surveyed reported a number of emotional and behavioural problems for children who are living with parents who are separated inside and outside the UK. Many parents reported that their children had become clingy and dependent on one parent. Children often suffered from separation anxiety and became socially withdrawn, and some described children having difficulty socialising and experiencing problems at school. Parents described how children displayed eating and sleeping problems, slow or poor language development, and can display anger and violence towards peers and family. Some children said that they feel guilty and blame themselves for the absence of a parent." So, George, what a horrific policy to impose on children, and the tweaks made in recent years have not fixed that damage at all. So, George, government has previously justified these moves and policies on grounds of families having to show that they can't support themselves, or can support themselves rather, and a strange integration argument. But these arguments have always been fig leaves, and they are particularly so now. Now, ensuring self-sufficiency has never really been what this is about, because, as the Honourable Member pointed out, the government doesn't actually bother to properly consider whether the person coming to the UK will be able to earn towards a financial target. It doesn't matter that the spouse coming to the country is well qualified, has good prospects of finding work, or has other forms of support available. That is all disregarded. And of course, as has already been pointed out, the Home Office will automatically ensure that their visa is subject to a no recourse to public funds condition anyway. And it's even less about self-sufficiency now, because there is absolutely no link between the thresholds, as I've said, that they've picked and the notion of self-sufficiency. The numbers are totally irrational. Unless the Minister is saying that nobody earning less than £29,000 or £39,000 per year from next year is capable of supporting their spouse, that's just an extraordinary proposition. Now, it would also have lots of implications for the policies in public sector pay, the minimum wage, social security and lots more. Indeed, as the Children's Commissioner report highlighted, these rules mean that actually people unable to bring their spouses in have had to have greater reliance on social security than otherwise they would, as they struggle to juggle work and caring responsibilities without their life partner by their side. And in terms of integration, that argument to me makes even less sense. Why will someone earning £40,000 and their spouse integrate better than a person earning £30,000 or their spouse? Again, per the Children's Commissioner, there is no evidence to suggest that integration has been enhanced, but there is evidence that it has been reduced. What this is really about, Sir George, is politics. shaving a couple of percentage points off net migration, sending a signal, a dog whistle really, doing untold damage to people's lives. Sir George, I finish by mentioning also that alongside these rules, couples are also hit by the extraordinary fees and upfront health charges. These provide yet another brutal barrier. My constituent Stephen, who previously served in the forces but has since then worked in oil and gas, does meet the rules requirements for the moment, but his entire income is now spent paying for the medicines required to keep his wife, who he met in 2011, alive. He meets the rules, but he cannot pay these fees and charges up front. At this rate, he may never get to bring his wife and her daughter to the UK. So can the Minister provide any hope to my constituent that an application would be accepted, even though these fees can't be met up front? As I said, Sir George, these are rotten rules from a rotten government. I very much hope that the next one does better.
Vaughan Bailey.
George, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Now, I am about to give the government a bit of a hard time on behalf of some of my constituents, but I do want to praise the Minister and put on record that this is a very thoughtful, caring Minister who has been tackling one of the biggest briefs in government, and I don't think anybody else would do as good a job, to be honest. I think there is a genuine paucity of ideas coming from particularly the opposition over the rhetoric, and there is also a genuine concern in the country, in all of our mailboxes, about the pressure of illegal and legal migration numbers on services and on the country, and it is that the government has tried to fix. But I think it is right that all of us today bring out our individual stories of constituents, because it's in those stories that we sometimes find the consequences and unintended consequences of well-meaning policy at the top that is trying to solve a very real problem. Now, I want to talk about two women today. The first is Rebecca Gray. Now, Sir George, you will know that every day is a school day in this place, and what Rebecca has taught me is never to underestimate the power of a feisty woman trying to protect and fight for her family while also armed with TikTok, because she has made a very compelling case across her social media, which has led to a number of other people getting in touch with Rebecca to tell their stories. Now, Rebecca contacted me in December 23 after there was the announcements about the visa salary requirement increases. She's lived in Turkey for the last 3 years. She's my constituent. I know her family. Actually, one of her siblings is a local councillor, but she's been in Turkey for 3 years with her Turkish husband because they've been caring for their terminally sick mother. And sadly, the mother-in-law has passed away. She's also been running a UK online business and has worked really hard. They've worked hard as a couple to save £62,000 for the savings threshold. She's been in a relationship with her husband for over 10 years. This is a love relationship, and they've been looking forward to returning to the UK, not least because they were at the epicentre of the earthquakes in February 2023. Now, these changed their lives forever. 250 local people that they know, family members as well, have lost their lives, and they don't want to live in Turkey anymore for safety reasons, as well as familial connections back in the Stroud and Gloucestershire area. Now, the new figure of 38,000 is basically unachievable for my constituent, and she questions whether it's achievable for many people that are working outside of London. She says she has a trade in the UK as a beauty therapist. She has her online business, so she's considered coming home to leaving her husband to work for 6 months to apply for the visa. However, in her trade, she will literally not get to that earnings threshold very easily. Now, beauty therapists, the beauty industry, hair and beauty industry, very, very skilled people. I defy anybody in government to take them out of our constituents. You would get a lot of angry, particularly women and me, with big eyebrows. But you know, the reality is these are people that we know and love. These are jobs that many of us rely on. And we've got a second issue with Rebecca's case, is that she is a self-employed income that is not treated the same as a PAYE income. And she says her husband is not dependent, has the right to work on upon arrival. The 62,000 we have in savings was held for 6 months, and it proves that I can support us during this period, but the potential new figure of 88,700 is just she just says, who on earth would spend that amount of money in the period? We have to provide proof. Why is the assumption that my husband wasn't work, and the focus is all on me as a sponsor rather than them as a couple? The question... I will give way, thank you.
grateful to the Honourable for giving way, because this is a very important point. Whether or not there is a case for a spousal visa, income connection, in principle is one matter, but does she not highlight here the difficulty that we now have? And that is that this area of policy has become so complex and there are so many exceptions and different rules applying to different people that really what we need to do is pare it right back to the start if we're going to have a scheme of this sort and make it one which is designed actually to meet people's needs rather than some political purpose, which is, I fear, where we have got to here.
I respect that comment. I think it's a meaningful intervention. I disagree that this is just a political point scoring. This is a genuine attempt to make it. But I think the simplicity of trying to simplify these rules is a genuinely important thing, particularly for families who are stressed, who are separated, or things like the safety of the earthquakes issue. People need to understand what their options are. But I do think the self-employed treatment and that disparity is something that government should look at very carefully. Now, so Rebecca's asks threefold, Minister, before I come on to my second lady very briefly, Sir George, if you allow me. The first is to have the ability to combine self-employed income and savings to meet the financial threshold requirements, but because those who are not self-employed can. This is unfair. She says that it is discrimination. The second is whether at least the new threshold, if we cannot go back to the old house, the new threshold of 29,000 is held. That's about at median earnings for this country, and to be held in place for longer, with the government having taken on board some of the evidence that we are bringing forward to you today. And the third is to potentially look at exemptions and special appeal routes so that families can put together their cases and make applications to the Home Office to be looked at very carefully, particularly where there is issues surrounding safety and where there's real evidence that there has been long-standing savings and income thresholds that will never be met on their particular profession. On the second lady that I met, I met a lady on the doorstep at the weekend. I canvass every weekend. She quite literally could not believe her luck that she had her MP on her doorstep, because this is something that has been concerning her for years and years. Now, she is South African. She's over on a spousal visa, and it's the eye-watering cost of that visa that she wanted to raise with me. In total, it will cost £14,000. The citizenship costs have also just gone up. This is a hard-working family that are tax-paying, UK tax-paying citizens. They've done everything right. They've dealt with the complexity of the system, but she says it's penalising her family for trying to do the right thing. And what she said is it's not a racism point, but she sees other people being treated differently when she is doing all of her points. And there's people coming across on small boats and getting accommodation. This is something that she was very concerned about, and it is a fairness point that is running through many of our constituents' concerns. What she has asked is whether there is a system that could be put in place whereby if you are going to have the outlay of those costs to meet the visa requirements, that it could be recouped in some sort of tax treatment later on as you continue to work and pay taxes in the country. She wants to see that her efforts and her payments out are recognised by the government in terms of her overall contribution to the country. And it'd be interesting to hear from the Minister on all of those points. Thank you.
Stephen Timms. Thank you very much. Sir George, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I do want to congratulate my honourable friend on securing this debate and the very compelling case he made in opening it. And I'm pleased as well to follow the honourable member for Stroud and agree with a great deal of what she said. My honourable friend set out the changes which are proposed. The Prime Minister argued, when we started talking about all this, that anyone bringing dependents to the UK must be able to support them financially, and we understand that point. But the changes that have been announced are going to take the minimum income requirement far beyond the income of most UK employees. It appears to be an arbitrary set of numbers, and it's a disproportionate increase with very unfair and harmful effects. When the Home Secretary set out his plan, of which the minimum income threshold increased requirement was part, He said this was going to deliver the biggest ever reduction in net migration. 300,000 people, he said, who came to the UK last year would not be able to do so. But as we've been reminded, family visas only accounted for 5% of total entry visas between January and September last year. Family visas have not made up more than 10% of total entry visas for over a decade. And the government's own analysis suggests the increased minimum income requirement will cut migration by between 3 and 10% of the promised 300,000 reduction in migration, and that's almost certainly an overestimate. The truth is that increasing income thresholds on spousal visas will barely dent migration figures. And I think it is extraordinary that the government did not even consult the Migration Advisory Committee before announcing this change. So it's not going to make very much impact on migration. The government's own analysis confirms that, but it is going to cause great hardship for those affected. Thousands of people who will have to live without their partners, thousands of children living without a parent. And my honourable friend pointed out that the Migrant Integration Policy Index places us second from bottom out of 56 for ease of family reunion. The Justice and Home Affairs Committee in the other place pointed out in their 2023 report, All Families Matter, wider harm reducing cohesion across society. Parents forced into single parenthood have to reduce involvement in the wider community. Children separated from their parents by arbitrary rules they can't understand, trust society less as a result. This is a spiteful change which will undermine cohesion in our society in the long term. And Conservative politicians very often recognise the damage caused by breaking up families, but here they are choosing to break them up quite deliberately. And all of us will suffer the downsides for society, which in other contexts, Conservative members will readily enumerate. But they're forcing those breakups by these changes that have been announced. My honourable friend pointed out that the Migration Observatory at Oxford University has shown that 70 to 74% of employees in the UK would not meet this £38,700 requirement. Now, the government surely isn't suggesting that only about a quarter of UK employees can support their dependents financially at the moment, but that appears to be the implication of the claims that they're making. And surely, again, as my honourable friend has suggested, a better standard, and there are various other standards that have been suggested in this debate, but surely a better one would be to ensure that anybody bringing dependents in the UK would have an income above the level at which they are ineligible for universal credit. That is a possible yardstick. Spain and the Netherlands, as we've heard, apply a standard along those lines, and it's certainly well below £38,700. So, Sir George, the increase in the minimum income requirement goes far beyond the level to deliver the government's stated aims for the threshold. It will reduce migration only minimally, but cause great hardship to thousands, and it will damage the fabric of our society. It will be ineffective, it will be unfair, and it will be harmful, and it should be scrapped.
Very good.
Thank you, Sir George. It's an honour to serve under your guidance this morning. And I want to congratulate and thank all those who have contributed to the debate so far, especially the Honourable Member for Sheffield Central, who has secured this debate and made an excellent introductory speech to it. I would argue that this introduction of the increased minimum income requirement of £29,000 a year last month to £38,700 by some point next year is both cruel and foolish. And not the Conservative Party really needs me to advise them, but it's fundamentally unconservative if we take conservatism to be about the family and about pragmatic economics, but more to that in a moment or two. I want to start with a question for the Minister. Do you think it gets to the heart of it all, really? His department, the Home Office, have said that this policy is all about ensuring that families that include a migrant are not a burden to the state. So I wonder if the Minister could define what constitutes a burden to the state, given that an individual on a spousal visa has no recourse to public funds. That's the first question I'd like him to consider. And then, as others have pointed out, what on earth led him to make this decision on the basis of no meaningful evidence or research? His own Migration Advisory Committee advised him against this. It's only a few years ago, 3 years since, they stated the following. They said that they were concerned that previous analysis may have given too much weight to the fiscal contribution of such migrants and insufficient attention to the benefits that accrue to both the family and society from the route. Why did the government not take note of that? And when we think about the impact, the benefits to family and society, I guess we could talk about the economic impact in an area like mine, which desperately depends upon a large proportion of migrants to make our economy work, social care and healthcare work, our hospitality and tourism industry work, but then again the families themselves, which surely is probably the most important aspect of this. And that's what I want to focus on next. A number of people, including Right Honourable Member, my friend who's just spoken on the impact on families, which will be very significant. We will see an increase in the length of separation before visas are obtained, if they are at all, between different parts of the family, and often these will be British children. Not that it's any better if they are children not born in the UK or not British. The impact on women will evidentially be far greater than on men. As things stand, as of last month's increase, 36% of employed women and 58% of men earn enough to meet the £29,000 threshold. But from next year, only 21% of women and 39% of men will be able to meet it. Has been suggested by my right honourable friend, the member for Orkney and Shetland, there will be regional disparities as well. We talk about levelling up. Well, £38,700, I'm assuming, is around an average, maybe even a below average salary within London. I'll tell you, in the northwest of England, it most definitely is not. So if we're concerned about levelling up, this is something that will do damage to businesses and to families in Cumbria and other parts of the north of England. The reality is that this new change will force British and settled mothers into solo parenting. It will force them into a position where they'll not be able to work because of the childcare requirements. There will be additional costs on the state, and it will cause heartache and pain and sadness and separation for families up and down our country. It's going to make it much harder, rather than easier, for mixed nationality families to integrate into society, so the social disbenefits are huge as well. British citizens and settled residents are very badly affected by these rules. And again, if we're doing a positive spin on what the Conservative Party's sort of ethics are about, so often we hear about family values. I believe very much in the importance of the family, and yet this is something that takes an absolute torpedo to family life and causes sadness, mental health problems, distress, lack of educational attainment, and forces people into solo parenting completely against the will of both those involved in the relationship. It is wicked, frankly, deeply cruel, and utterly counterproductive. I say it's counterproductive because either this is going to fail, and there's been lots of evidence from members who've spoken so far that this policy will fail in terms of driving down net migration, and that's bad from a competence point of view, or it will work, and that will be even worse. And that will be even worse. The foolishness of this is enormous. We know that the minimum income requirement doesn't directly affect people working in care, but the refusal to allow care workers to bring a spouse with them anymore absolutely will have an impact on care. So let's look on the impact on social care in Cumbria. 1 in 5 social care jobs within our county is currently vacant. And they're vacant for a number of reasons, but fundamentally because our workforce is far too small. It's too small partly because of the government's failure to help us to tackle the affordable housing crisis in our communities. We see second homes and holiday lets gobbling up the homes that people who are currently local or who might become local could live in. So where is our workforce to be able to contribute to every part of our economy? But we're also, of course, damaged by silly visa rules which make it impossible for us to recruit people from overseas to supplement our workforce. People will often say, well, we should be making sure we tackle the care crisis by paying people better. Abso-blooming-lutely. So why is the government not doing that? The Liberal Democrats have a policy, which I'm not saying is the answer to everything, but saying in social care we should increase the minimum wage by £2 to £13.44. That would at least mean that care providers will be paying their workers more than they will get paid in the supermarket or in other roles, which leads to so many people leaving social care. But there's no sign of that happening whatsoever. And so even what little that those care providers can do to bring in workers from overseas is being damaged by this government. There's a consequence to all this, of course, not just the misery from those people who can't get care, not only the hard work for those people who are working in social care, having to work extra hours under enormous pressure, doing shorter and shorter visits because there just aren't enough colleagues to do the job, but 24% of the beds in the Morecambe Bay hospitals are currently occupied by people who are medically fit to leave but can't get out and have a care package because we do not have the carers. And these proposals, these policies, make that situation even worse. And the people who are hurt by it are my constituents who can't get care, and indeed my constituents who are not able to bring their families with them, which is just cruel and miserable. But the minimum income requirement absolutely does affect those people working in hospitality and tourism. I'll tell the Minister this, 63% of the hospitality and tourism businesses in the Lake District and wider Cumbria are working below capacity, not able to meet a demand that is there because they cannot find the staff. Now, we are a place, the Lake District, 80% of the working age population is already working in hospitality and tourism. There is no reservoir of unused labour that could be turned into workers in hospitality and tourism. And so the government's policies, and this making it even worse, means that our economy is not able to punch at its weight. We could be contributing so much more to growth in our country. 20 million people visit the lakes every single year. There are 60,000 jobs within hospitality and tourism in Cumbria, and we're not able to punch at our weight the way we should be doing because the government is tying the hands of hospitality and tourism businesses. It's economically stupid, but it's also deeply damaging to individuals. Let's go back to what we now know, that 71% of women and 61% of men, 79% of women and 61% of men do not meet the minimum income requirement. So Cumbria can expect perhaps up to 2/3 of its overseas carers, of its overseas staff, to leave. What a miserable and stupid thing this is to do. So the policy the government is choosing, and others have alluded to this, is something because they believe that there is a view out there that is very, very anti-immigrant. And they are wanting to do things, and last night's votes and all the rest of it are all part and parcel of dog whistle or indeed foghorn politics to try to demonstrate the government is as beastly about immigrants as parties to the right of them. And that is incredibly stupid. There are two forms of leadership, Sir George. One is where you spy where you think the crowd is going and you run round the front of it and pretend it was all your idea in the first place. That's pathetic and it's not leadership. And the second is you know what's right and you make the case. Because I think all of us in this room believe, to one degree or another, in us having secure borders and controlling migration. And given we have taken back control, not that being in the EU stopped us controlling our borders, but given that we are in a situation where we control migration policy, I have this radical suggestion for the Minister. How about controlling migration in Britain's interests rather than doing us harm in the process. So this policy harms my constituents. It harms people from Appleby to Ambleside to Arnside, Kendal, Kirby Stephen, Kirby Lonsdale, people who rely upon care, people who have hospitality and tourism businesses are damaged by this. But worst of all are the people who are at the heart of it. And I'm going to finish with this. I talk about one, I won't mention a name, but a constituent of mine from Windermere, whose husband is from overseas, and they spent more than a year separated, married for some time, separated, because of what we already have, and which is about to get worse. And she refers to the situation as a hard and cruel process, hard and cruel for her and her family. And then this, again, I won't quote too many details, but here's a message from I'm going to say he's a former constituent. As far as I'm concerned, he's absolutely somebody I am proud to represent. He says, I currently live in blank with my non-British wife and 2 children. I grew up and lived most of my life in Kendal, but will probably never be able to return now, at least not with my wife. There is very little chance I could ever earn the proposed £38,700 needed for a spousal visa. It's way too high and will only serve to break up genuine families who only want to live an honest life back in the UK. My town, my community, has been robbed of that family. For them to come back, they'd have to be divided. This policy is stupid and it is cruel and it should be cancelled.
Before I call, there are 2 more people from the back benches seeking to get in. I just need to remind them that at 10:30 I will be calling the front bench spokespersons from the 3 parties. So if they both cooperate, we can get them both in. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Sir George, and thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central, a fellow Sheffield MP, for calling this important debate. And I'm glad that Sheffield is a city of sanctuary, a diverse city which has a proud tradition of welcoming people who come here to work or create a new life away from conflict and persecution. Before I begin, I'd like to point the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest for the help I receive in this area from the Refugee, Asylum and Migration Policy Project. I'm also the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Migration. Although I won't dwell too much on the context behind the debate today, it does seem as though ministers are intent on blaming every kind of migrant for the chaos they have created in the asylum and migration system and beyond, whether that's asylum seekers, social care workers, overseas graduates and now families. The approach of ministers seems to be to disregard completely the benefits that a culturally diverse global workforce brings to the UK. If any public opinion is against families being able to be together, when you explain no recourse to public funds to people, I bet any objection would fall away to spousal visas, and this would surely disappear, because this is a cruel and does have unintended consequences. And today I want to highlight the human cost of that by raising the experience of my constituent, Jim, and his daughter, Eleanor. She currently lives in Japan with her husband and her son and wants to return to the UK with her family. Her husband is not a British citizen, but her son is a British national. They contacted me after they heard the minimum income threshold would increase to £29,000, worried about what this would mean for the savings they would need to come to the UK. Before the increases, the minimum income threshold, it would have cost Eleanor £66,000 to come home with her family. To meet this requirement, she and her family did everything they could to save. If this figure was not shocking enough, now under the new shifted goalposts, it will require £88,500 in savings. That's on top of the money for visa fees, immigration health surcharge, an English language test, a life in the UK test, a tuberculosis test and certified translations. The cost to Eleanor to live with her family in her country of birth is now potentially around £100,000. And of course, that number will increase dramatically once the new threshold of £38,700 is implemented. Eleanor could have come back to the UK now without her family and find a job above the minimum threshold, but that would mean leaving them behind in Japan for who knows how long, and there is no guarantee, given the statistics that we've heard, that she would be able to get a job that has that required salary. According to a survey conducted by Families Reunite, in situations where families are divided because of the immigration rules, 88% of respondents were separated for more than a year, 53% for more than 3 years, and 23% for more than 7 years. That is far too much of a gamble for Eleanor and her family. On the 8th of February, I wrote to the Minister requesting that he clarify the savings requirement for the entire family to move here and what that would be, and asked for the impact assessment that had been made on how this policy would affect people like Eleanor. I don't believe I've yet received a response, and I would like to ask him directly, while he is here, does he think it is right that a British national and her British national son, who should need to have in the region of £100,000 in the bank to live as a family in the UK, what does he think is an appropriate price tag to attach to family life? Chair, these are hard questions to answer because you can't put a price on the right to family, and yet this policy aims to do just that. And that's why it's time ministers thought again about this rule that seeks the price of everything while realising the value of nothing.
Thank you, Sir George. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Pardon me. And I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Sheffield Central for bringing forward an important debate again. Once again, I'm very glad to have listened to his speech. Now, I'm not going to bring forward any cases from my own Arfon constituency, not that there aren't any. White, Welsh-speaking North West Wales is susceptible to this particular rule, as is everywhere else in the UK. I want to concentrate on one particular point, which is the discriminatory nature of this rule. Now, as we know, the government's intention is to increase the level to 29,000 and then to 38,700 at the end of the year. And that is notionally based on the cost of supporting families, irrespective of public funds. And that's raised from 18,600, of course. And looking at the history, that figure was recommended by the Migration Advisory Committee, and even at that point they were saying that 45% of people would would fall short of that particular criteria. And I was interested to hear, of course, that the government didn't take advice from the Migration Advisory Committee before bringing this change forward. And the argument that I would make very, very briefly, Sir George, is that it is fair in form but unfair in application. It is what is sometimes called the freedom to dine at the Ritz. The door of the Ritz is open to all, but only some people are able to enter and enjoy its wonderful facilities. I'm sure they are wonderful. Never been there myself. But it is the freedom to dine at the Ritz. That is, it's discriminatory against some groups, not directly, but indirectly. The membership of those groups leads them to be more likely to fail to meet that particular criterion, because it is based, of course, on income, which some groups are less able to meet. Most obviously and most egregiously, I think, are the protected categories of being woman or being black, whom, as we know, people in those groups earn less than the population in general. So my question, which I will elaborate on in a moment, my question to the Minister is how can he justify such indirect discrimination, which it is on the face of it, indirect discrimination. If I could just very briefly consider the pay gap, as it's called, as far as Wales is concerned, and this applies to other parts of the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in fact most of England outside London and the South East. The median income in Wales is 32,371. That's the median, not the average, of course, which is a lower figure. In Gwynedd, part of which I represent, the median is 30,500. Again, median, not average. Now, that is above the 29,000 of the new level, but below the intended 38,700. So, in that latter case of 38,700, very shortly, the vast majority of earners in Wales will be unable to meet this new criterion through no fault of their own, apart from their income that they earn, and that is to some extent based on where they live, because, as we know, incomes in Wales are lower than elsewhere. And there is a further particular group which has been referred to by other honourable members, that is young people, the people who are more likely to move abroad, perhaps for education, for work, more likely to fall in love, more likely to start a family, more likely, therefore, to be unable to return to the UK because of this particularly indirectly discriminatory rule. So, as I said, my question to the Minister, and I certainly don't envy his job, as another honourable member said, is how does he justify using a criterion which will structurally discriminate against specific groups, and shortly, and in the broadest of terms, my concern, the majority of people of Wales. As I said, how can he justify the freedom to dine at the Ritz in respect of a basic human right, that is to marry and to have a family and to live with that family, a freedom which I think is open to the Minister and possibly most people in this room, but not to the majority of the people of Wales and many, many more people across the UK. Thank you.
Alison Thewlis.
Sir George, it's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and I rise very much in opposition to this higher threshold and this discriminatory threshold. And indeed, over the years I've been elected, I've had many constituents come to me who have struggled to meet the 18,600 threshold, who have been separated from their family, from their loved ones, who have worked multiple jobs to try and make that target. People who've missed out by the equivalent of an hour's overtime on the target and have not been able to bring their loved ones to stay with them. The announcement of increasing the threshold to 29,000, 34,000 and then eventually, they believe, 38,700 just prior to Christmas caused great distress among my constituents, as reflected by the many contributions by members here this morning. People who were extremely distressed because they didn't know what that would mean for them, for their families, for their ability to have a family life. And I want to put on record that the people affected by this are our friends, our family, our neighbours, our constituents. I want to thank them all for the honour that they have done in choosing Scotland as their home. They deserve much better than having a price put on love and a price put on family love and family life by this Conservative government. And for many of these people, they do valuable jobs. They're not necessarily well-paid jobs, but they are indeed very valuable jobs to our economy and to our society. And as honourable members have highlighted, these jobs are in a wide range of sectors. The honourable member from Westmoreland talked about people in the hospitality sector. Others have talked about the impact on universities. And the 38,700 threshold that's been talked about is well above the salaries for most postdoctoral researchers. It will undermine Scotland's ability to compete, to attract people to work in science and technology, which are the great sectors that we wish to have people come and innovate in, already hampered by the impact of Brexit. They will be further hindered by the inability to attract people. And I had such a researcher at my surgery quite recently, and he had 2 teenage children. He had sought to bring them over here. He had sought for those children eventually to obtain British citizenship, and he had this all planned in his head for how this would work. He knew that it would be phenomenally expensive as a family of 4 to come here and do that, when you take into account having to renew their visa every 2.5 years and the immigration health surcharge. But he was prepared to do that. But the difficulties put in his way by the Home Office had led him to think, why am I doing this? Why would I go through so much expense when the government makes me feel as if it's not worth it and I am not welcome? That is an awful message for this government to be sending out. And as others have spoken about, this is already an extremely expensive system, and people see little reward from that. And I had somebody contact me, an Australian-born British citizen who has, over the years, lived in Scotland, lived in Australia. And he says that he wants to come and bring his family here and bring up his children in Scotland. But he has found this system prohibitively expensive and again wonders why he should do so and how many people's skills are we going to lose out on because this government can't see the value in what they bring to our society. And as other members have pointed out also, there is a disproportionate impact in all of this, in this discriminatory and expensive proposal that they bring forward. It means that women, particularly, and people of ethnic minority backgrounds, and people who are young, and people who are in places where the earnings are not so high, so particularly in Scotland. And the government has produced no equality impact assessment that I have seen to see what the impact of this policy will be on people in different geographies, on women and ethnic minorities, on self-employed people and young people. And it seems absolutely ludicrous that they have gone ahead with this policy without publishing this equality impact assessment. And I've also had an email from somebody whose family had moved abroad, and they worry that they are now the door is being closed on those families from ever returning. And he has said, my British-born nephew living in Canada and married to a Canadian citizen would never be able to return to the UK with his family. This isn't about affecting some kind of group of foreigners who want to come here. This affects people who are already here and people who moved abroad for work or for love or for study, and they had the door closed upon them by this government. It is absolutely appalling. I will indeed.
Mr Chairman, first of all, can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Sheffield Central for bringing and apologise to him for it was my Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee day, so I couldn't come down immediately. But I wanted to put on record my support for Mr Chairman for others from across the United Kingdom who have the same problems. Us in Northern Ireland, I've fought a number of spousal and partner issues over the years from South Africa, from the United States, where the issue of monies have been incredibly critical. I just want to say that what the Honourable Lady is outlining and what others have outlined are replicated in Northern Ireland, unfortunately with the same severity, primarily because those in Northern Ireland have a shorter and smaller wage income than they have in the rest of the United Kingdom. So for us in Northern Ireland, it's critical as well. So I commend the Honourable Lady and the Honourable Gentleman in particular for what we said.
The Honourable Gentleman, as ever, makes a very pertinent point to this debate, and I'd like to hear from the Minister what consideration he has taken of this on the nations of the United Kingdom, because there doesn't seem to me to be any objective assessment of what this will actually mean and what impact it will have. And certainly the Scottish Government has expressed concerns about this. We have presented in Scotland an alternative to the UK's hostile environment, to the awful immigration system and the expensive immigration system that we have, which damages Scotland's economy, damages Scotland's society, and we very much would like to see devolution in the short term, but in the long term, full control over our immigration system, because at the moment it certainly does not benefit the people of Scotland and it does not work in our interests. And speaking further about the impact on hospitality, retail and tourism, that has had a huge impact as the result of the ending of freedom of movement. I think that the Labour Party wants to continue the end of freedom of movement, which is absolutely economically and socially devastating. And there was a report in newspapers recently about Italian restaurants in London, where it is a better level of pay, saying that the end of freedom of movement and these visa thresholds was catastrophic for their industry. And I've heard the same over many years from people working in Indian restaurants who want to bring particularly skilled chefs over from India and from Pakistan and from Bangladesh to come and work in their restaurants. Again, that is a barrier in their path, and again, that has an impact on the sustainability of those businesses because they cannot pay wages at that higher 38,700 level. And I would like to ask the Minister, because this has not yet been justified, why is it 38,700? Is this a number plucked out of the air? Because we know that they haven't got this number from the Migration Advisory Committee. I would like to know which bit evidence that this salary is based upon, because if that's the minimum that anybody needs to live, why are wages in this country not at a level that would give you a 38,700 income for each person? Why has that been selected? Why has it been plucked out of the air? And it's certainly not the argument, as the Honourable Member for Sheffield Central began with, that these people are any kind of burden upon the state, because they cannot be They have no recourse to public funds. They cannot claim benefits. They pay in to the NHS through the Innovation Health Surcharge, which the government have recently increased as well. So they are not any kind of burden on the state. It is a complete untruth to say that they are, and it is deeply unfair to say that they are. And I would like to know from the government on what basis they consider that that might be the case, because they have been deeply unclear about that. I would also like to mention the excellent contribution from my friend, the Honourable Member for Cumbernauld South and Kirkintilloch East. And he talks about this policy being a means test on marriage. And that is absolutely true. It is a tax on love. And the impact that he talked about, the impact on children, is certainly something I've seen quite regularly at my constituency surgeries. Children who have been separated from their parents for a very long period of time. He spoke very powerfully about the impact on children's mental and physical health. And the government, which claims to be a family party, well, it's not a family party if you only pick people who were born in Britain and happen to be white. It is not a family party when it discriminates against people who happen to have been born somewhere else, fall in love with somebody from someone else and had a family with them. They should think about the discriminatory impact upon that, and they should think about the impact that that has, the message that that sends out about the status of Britain in the world. It does not happen in Scotland's name. We seek an alternative to that. We seek an independent Scotland where we can value everybody who comes, who contributes, who works, who settles and lives in Scotland. And we thank them for that. We don't close the door and make them feel unwelcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'd like to thank and pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central, for securing this important debate. He delivered an incredibly powerful speech, which included a number of examples of people who've had their lives really turned upside down by this policy shift. I know that this is an issue by which many individuals and families across the country have been profoundly impacted, and that there has been real concern over the government's policy changes and handling of these changes. And I'll come to those points very shortly. But before doing so, I did also just want to thank my honourable friends, the members for Wirral West, East Ham and Sheffield Hallam, for their really important contributions to this debate. So, George, this policy change to raise the minimum income threshold in order to secure a visa for a spouse from £18,600 to £29,000 and then later £38,700 is the direct result of the Conservative government wanting to bring down immigration, having allowed net migration to spiral to record levels of 745,000 in 2022. This despite their repeated promise to the electorate that they would be bringing numbers down to the tens of thousands. In 2019, the incoming Conservative government promised to reduce the level of net migration, which at that time was 245,000, but since then that figure has trebled. We on these benches are aware of this trend, and we have set out plans to reduce our economy's reliance on migrant workers by reforming the skills system, getting people off long-term sick leave back into work, and by ending the 20% discount for businesses recruiting from abroad in shortage sectors, and expecting businesses to draw up workforce plans to ensure that they are able to recruit more local resident talent. But turning now to the specifics of this debate, the historic stated aim of the spousal visa threshold has been to make sure that couples and families have the income which enables them to be self-reliant so that they don't need to rely on our social security system. That is why the income threshold was set at around £18,600 previously, with additional requirements per dependent. Now, we agree with that basic aim, which is why the level set must reflect the genuine level needed and required to support family in the UK, and it mustn't just be a number that is plucked out of thin air arbitrarily. That is why we have consistently raised concerns over the lacking evidence base behind the initial rise to £29,000, because the government has extraordinarily failed to provide any impact assessment on the number of people who will be affected by this shift, or the numbers of people who will be prevented from coming to Britain to join their loved ones. So whilst we support attempts to deliver more sustainable levels of net migration to get the balance right in our economy and our society, then the government must be honest and clear in providing a full impact assessment in order that any member in this chamber and beyond is able to fully understand the impact of the changes that they are proposing on their constituents and to make informed choices and based on an informed analysis. We on these benches are strong believers in evidence-based policy making, in stark contrast, I have to say, to this government, which appears to be addicted to headline chasing, performative posturing and making policy on the hoof. We do find it deeply disappointing that ministers have chosen to shoot from the hip on a number of policies across the spectrum of government, but to have done so on the matter that we are debating today is particularly reprehensible, given how directly it impacts on the deeply personal life choices that people have made and are making. Indeed, by appearing to pull these 29,000 and 39,000 thresholds out of thin air, ministers have quite frankly behaved in a glib and flippant manner that is both contemptuous of Parliament and shockingly disrespectful towards the couples and families whose lives have been turned upside down by these changes. The failure or refusal of ministers to publish the impact assessments is particularly baffling since we know that both financial and equalities impact assessments have been completed, as my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central, pointed out in his speech. A report by the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee makes clear its utter exasperation with repeated failures by the Home Office to publish the information that members of both houses would need to properly scrutinise the proposed changes and consider their potential implications. And I quote in their words, "A failure to provide impact information and on a timely basis makes it impossible for Parliament to scrutinise the legislation properly. Moreover, impact information should be a useful tool in the policy-making process, helping departments to refine and improve their proposals. It appears to us that, instead, the Home Office too often tacks on impact analysis as an afterthought. And for good measure, I will give way.
I apologise for intervening again, but I'm very conscious sitting here that in Northern Ireland the average wage, I understand, is £28,939. Many people are on a less wage and not there. Does the Shadow Minister believe that the Minister, in his response to all of the questions that are being asked, should ask, in my case, the Northern Ireland Assembly for their opinion in relation to this, will give them the facts and a realism in this, the facts and figures, and the same thing should apply as well to the Scottish Parliament and indeed to the Welsh Assembly, because if we collate all those three regions, then they'll come up with different figures.
I thank the honourable member for that excellent intervention, and he's absolutely right, because I think the point he is making is that we need to get an aggregate picture of the overall impact of this policy across the United Kingdom. But of course that aggregate picture needs to be built up through the building blocks of key stakeholders and inputs, including, of course, the part of the United Kingdom from which he comes, as indeed colleagues from Scotland and Wales, I'm sure, would concur. So he's absolutely right in that point. And for good measure, the committee's report added that we have criticised the Home Office's explanatory material with such frequency that we are concerned there may be a systemic or cultural issue that is preventing the Home Office from getting it right. So could the Minister therefore please explain to us today in his remarks, what is the stated aim of this, what is the actual aim, of this policy change? Is it to make sure migrants are self-reliant and do not need to rely on our social security system, or has that aim changed? How was the 29,000 figure decided? Could we please see some workings around that? Why is the government introducing a huge jump to almost 39,000? Again, why that particular number? And will he promise to fully consult on the impact of the 29,000 change before moving any further, and then the need for any subsequent rise? Why has he not provided an impact assessment for this policy, both for the 29,000 and for the 39,000? Also, why has the Minister not asked the Migration Advisory Committee to undertake a review into this policy change, or even to have asked their view on it? The first thing Labour would do, if we're privileged to form the next government, would be to ask the MAC to review this policy and to make recommendations about the level at which the threshold for spousal visas should be set in future. The MAC review that we would commission would consider a range of factors: the historic aim of ensuring migrants are able to be self-sufficient and how the benefit system connects with that aim. My honourable member the member for Sheffield Central has suggested exploring the way in which the threshold might interact with the minimum wage, the number of people affected and how they will be impacted, and the overall impact on net migration. Now, the MAC haven't actually commissioned a report specifically on the family visa issue since 2011-2012, but they did say in their 2020 annual report that given the amount of time that's passed since the 2012 changes came into effect, a fresh review could be worthwhile. They said, "We think now would be an opportune time to reconsider the minimum income requirements associated with this route. The MAC are concerned that previous analysis may have given too much weight to the fiscal contribution of such migrants and insufficient attention to the benefits that accrue to both the family and society from the route. In addition, it is a considerable time since the current income requirements were introduced, so more evidence should now be available to review the impact of these requirements." So could the Minister please explain why the government has failed to act on the MAC's 2020 suggestion, and can he now commit to requesting that review now? Sir George, hard-working, good people, their partners and their families are at the very heart of this policy. So why did it take so long for the government to confirm that those people who are already here and reapplying will be exempt from the rise? This caused a huge amount of undue hurt and anxiety, and I'm afraid it confirmed the view held by many that the government is motivated by performative cruelty. And on a related point, can the government also make clear to all those who started a new application before the changes came in that it will be processed under the old thresholds? And a final question for the Minister. At the very least, will he today commit to making a statement to the House, setting out the results of the impact assessment, rather than bulldozing through secondary legislation which can have a far-reaching and profoundly damaging impact on the lives of couples and families all over Britain? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I just start by congratulating the honourable member for Sheffield Central for securing this debate on an important issue and one where we've obviously heard a variety of different opinions and many points of clarification and questions have been asked. And I will seek to try and deal with as many of those as possible in responding to the debate. But first, it might just be helpful if I set out the background to the decision to raise the minimum income requirement, which I will refer to as the MIR in the interests of brevity. Net migration is too high, and we must get it into a more sustainable place with better balance. In the year to June 2023, it was estimated to be at 672,000. Last year, we set out measures to bring those numbers down, tightening the rules on care workers, skilled workers, and making sure that people can support their family members that they bring over. The British people want to see decisive action, and we're delivering the change that we promised, lifting pressure on public services and protecting British workers with the utmost urgency. That's why we've set out and implemented a comprehensive plan to do so. I will take a couple of interventions early, Sir George, because I'm conscious there's a lot that I need to respond to, but I'll gladly take the honourable gentleman.
You mentioned public opinion. I rather suspect if the government canvassed public opinion, they would be absolutely shocked and appalled by the fact that their friends and colleagues have been split apart from their spouses. So you praise and aid public opinion, but what research has the government done on these specific proposals?
So I think that there are elements of this policy that have not been reflected in any of the contributions made that are materially relevant, and I will come to later in my remarks in terms of safeguards that I think actually most people would think are fair and reasonable. It's a firm but fair approach that we are taking overall to tackle net migration, And it will not only bring numbers down substantially, but also address the injustice of a system which, if left untouched, would reduce employers seeking to recruit cheap labour from overseas at the expense of the British worker and put an unsustainable pressure on our most vital public services. I'll gladly give way to my honourable friend.
Take early intervention, so I come in now. It was my understanding from the Labour front bench is that they want to bring the numbers down, and exactly they have the ambition that the government does as well. But I listened really carefully. I got my pen out to write things down, but I didn't actually hear any specifics or ideas. Can I just understand whether it's the Minister's understanding that Labour plans to scrap the net migration package, because I'm slightly unclear about that. And I think that's really relevant to my constituents who are thinking through what their options are.
Well, I'm afraid that is an opaque situation. It is very unclear what the it is very unclear. I'm afraid. Well, I'm afraid the honourable gentleman and his party refuse consistently to say what they are going to do on borders and migration, both on legal migration and on illegal migration. And yet again,
banter across and get on with the debate, please. Thank you.
The truth is that during the remarks from the shadow front bench, there was no clarification as to the stance that they would take with regard to the package of measures through the net migration package that are already in train as to whether this is something that they would seek to cancel or not. People can draw their own conclusions with regard to that. And the honourable member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale raised a whole host of different issues in relation to borders and migration policy, including the issue of care workers. I would argue that seeing 120,000 dependents coming with 100,000 care workers just isn't sustainable. He raised the issue of illegal migration and conflated the legal migration piece with the illegal migration piece. But again, I make no apology for the steps that the government is taking, including through the legislation that we passed yesterday, to try and put out of business the evil criminal gangs who put people in small boats, take their money, send them to sea, and have no regard as to whether they get here safely or not, the consequences of which we have seen yet again this morning in the most terrible and tragic of ways. We're working, with regard to the package of measures that we're introducing on net migration, to make strong headway to deliver the changes, with further improvements to modernise and enhance the security of the UK border continuing throughout 2024. The decision to raise the MIR is a key part of our plan to reduce overall migration levels. Taken together, the changes we're implementing will mean that 300,000 people who came to the UK last year will not now be able to come. The right to family life is a qualified right, and in making this decision, we've carefully balanced that right against the legitimate aim to protect the economic well-being of the UK. I've already given way to the honourable gentleman. I'm very conscious that I want to allow the proposer of the debate to be able to say a few words at the end as well. And there was that legitimate aim to protect the economic well-being of the UK. The MIR was introduced in July 2012 to ensure that family migrants could be supported at a reasonable level so they do not unreasonably become a burden on the British taxpayer, and to help ensure that they can participate sufficiently in everyday life to facilitate their integration into British society. I'll gladly give way to him.
I thank the Minister for giving way on that point. On the point of the burden, given that he has heard from many members that spouses coming to the UK are not, have no recourse to public funds and pay the health surcharge, in what way specifically are they a burden?
So this is a point that I wanted to come to during the course of my response, because on access to public funds, our position is that the MIR will prevent migrant partners from accessing public funds once they achieve settlement, when they would be entitled to access public funds should they be needed. They're not entitled to public funds on arrival, as has been said and as has been acknowledged. But if they're destitute, at risk of destitution, reasons relating to the welfare of a child, or facing exceptional circumstances, that dynamic, of course, changes. Where we allow access, the applicant is likely to move to the 10-year route to settlement, and that is the area with which the issue of access to public funds is relevant. The minimum income requirement has not been increased in line with inflation or real wages since its introduction, nor has it been adjusted in light of rising numbers of migrants using the route. It's in that context that we've reviewed the threshold and taken the decision to raise it to match the level of income needed for someone to come here as a skilled worker, which, as members will be aware, is £38,700 per year. This ensures that migration policy is supportive of our wider ambition for the UK to be a high-wage, high-productivity, high-skill economy. That is the basis upon which the level has been determined. And with regard to the issue about consultation with the Migration Advisory Committee, previous advice and evidence provided by the MAC regarding net fiscal contributions and access to benefits was considered when making this decision. We did not seek further advice from the MAC before making the decision to increase the MIR. But we do recognise, I'm going to very quickly give way to it because I'm conscious that there's a few more points to respond to.
Why did he not ask the Migration Advisory Committee for its views?
So we, of course, have commissioned the MAC on several fronts over recent months. They are commissioned in relation to the graduate route currently. We have asked them to carry out a review of the immigration salary list with a fuller review of that now set to take place. So there are ongoing work streams with the Migration Advisory Committee, and it is, of course, within the gift of ministers to make requests of them to consider areas of policy in relation to migration, and we will keep that position under review as we do in relation to the entirety of our immigration system and the policy levers that we have available to us as government. One of the key elements, I think, that hasn't been reflected over the course of the debate today is the fact that we have recognised the need to allow families time to plan effectively and make arrangements to meet the relevant income requirement. And that's why we're implementing the increase incrementally, nor has it been applied retrospectively. The first increase to £29,000 came into force on the 11th of April. A second planned increase will take the threshold to £34,500, with the third rise to at least £38,700 taking place by early 2025. Two key elements of the policy which haven't been given an airing today, that is one of them, but also when you consider the fact that this hasn't been applied retrospectively, but also the fact that we will continue to grant permission where to do otherwise would breach the applicant's Article 8 rights, the right to family life under the ECHR. This assessment involves considering whether there are insurmountable obstacles to family life between the applicant, their partner, and any children continuing outside the UK. And that is considered as part of the decision-making process by caseworkers, allowing those factors to be considered to make sure that we get the right decisions when it comes to individual cases and that due and proper regard is given to all of the relevant circumstances. I am always very happy, Sir George, to debate the intricacies of our policies, but the reality is that net migration is too high. This government has a policy to bring those numbers down by 300,000 in the way that I have described, with a number of changes that are now all in motion, having been developed and having been announced and having given time for people to adjust to those changes in advance of them coming into force. I believe that we do have a responsibility to reduce the numbers, and that is what our plan is designed to achieve. But the change, as I say, is not retrospective, and it is being introduced incrementally, and there is, of course, that Article 8 opportunity within the application process for people to be able to set out their circumstances so that the right decisions can be made on individual cases.
Can I call on Paul Blomfield to wind up the debate briefly?
Sir George, and can I thank all colleagues for their contributions, and particularly the Honourable Member for Stroud, and reassure her that I know she is not alone on the Conservative benches in the concerns that she expressed. There have been contributions to the debate from all parts of the UK and from 6 political parties represented in the House. We might present our arguments through the prism of our particular party perspective, but I think the same case has shone through all contributions, that this policy is not fair, it's not in the interests of our country, There are different approaches. They should be explored. We need to drop this policy now, develop a better alternative, and I have to say referring it to the MAC would be a useful first step.
Question is that this House has considered minimum income thresholds for partners and spousal visas. Many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.